Welcome back. In our last journey, we walked through 60 million years of galactic history. We watched the Necrons trade their souls for immortality and find only emptiness. We saw the Aeldari perfect themselves into extinction. We learned that the warp, the ocean beneath reality, was broken by ancient wars and has never healed. All of that happened before humanity's story truly began. Tonight, we trace the rise of our own species. From primitive origins on a single world, to an empire that touched the stars, to a collapse so complete that it nearly erased us from existence. And then, from the ashes of that collapse, the emergence of a figure who would reshape the galaxy according to his vision, or his nightmare, depending on your perspective. This is the story of humanity's golden age, its fall into darkness, and the beginning of the eternal war that defines the 42nd millennium. So settle back in. Let the darkness wrap around you, and let me tell you how humanity learned to reach for the stars, and how those stars taught us to bleed. Let's go back, far back, to a time before the Imperium, before the Emperor revealed himself, before humanity even knew there were other intelligent species in the galaxy, somewhere around the 15th millennium. M15 in imperial dating, though these dates are reconstructions, guesses based on fragmentary records and archaeological evidence. The Age of Technology. What the Mechanicus calls the Dark Age, though dark is a profound irony. Because this was humanity's golden age, the time when we achieved wonders that the Imperium of the 42nd millennium can barely comprehend, let alone replicate. Terra, Earth, our homeworld. It was not yet the hive-covered, planet-sized city it would become. Not yet holy Terra, the throne world of a million-world empire. It was simply home. One planet among billions, beautiful in its ordinariness. Humanity had already spread beyond Earth by this point. Mars had been colonized. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn bore human settlements. Slow generation ships had begun the long journey to nearby star systems. We were young, curious, ambitious in the way that species are before the universe teaches them to be afraid. We had not yet encountered the Aeldari, who were at the height of their power and paid no attention to primitive mammals stumbling into space. We had not yet discovered the orcs, who were scattered and degraded from their original Krork form. We had not yet awakened any of the sleeping Necron tomb worlds. We were alone, or thought we were. And in that solitude, we built miracles. The standard template construct. STC. 3 letters that the Mechanicus of the 42nd millennium would kill for, die for, wage wars across entire sectors to recover even fragments of. Imagine a database, but not just any database. Imagine the collected knowledge of human civilization at its absolute peak. Every piece of technology, every scientific principle, every engineering technique, every medical procedure, all of it encoded into a system that could be accessed anywhere, by anyone, with instructions so clear that even isolated colony worlds could build advanced technology from local materials. The STC was humanity's gift to itself, a way to ensure that no matter how far we spread, no matter how isolated colony worlds became, they would never lose access to the knowledge that made civilization possible. Need to build a fusion reactor? The STC would provide complete instructions, adjusted for local materials and conditions. Need to construct a plasma weapon? The STC would show you how, step by step, with alternatives if you lacked certain resources. Need to terraform a hostile world? The STC contained protocols for atmospheric processing, temperature regulation, ecosystem establishment. It was not AI, not in the way we think of artificial intelligence. The STC was more like an incredibly sophisticated expert system. It didn't think, it didn't create. It simply contained the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of human achievement, organized in a way that made it accessible to anyone who needed it. Every colony ship carried an STC database. Every long-range exploration mission had one. It was the foundation that allowed humanity to expand across the stars without fragmenting into 1,000 separate technological branches. It kept us unified, connected, human. When the Mechanicus of M42 searches ancient ruins for STC technology, they're looking for devices built according to these templates. Machines constructed using instructions from humanity's golden age, even fragments, partial printouts, corrupted data files are treated as holy relics, because the Imperium has lost the ability to create new STCs. They can only maintain, poorly, what was built before. The STC is one of the great tragedies of human history. We had a library containing everything we'd ever learned, and we lost it. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophe, but slowly, over thousands of years of isolation and warfare and the simple degradation of technology when no one remains who understands how it works. By M42, complete STC systems are myths. The Mechanicus believes they exist somewhere, buried in some forgotten archive or lost colony world. They send explorator fleets into the darkness, chasing rumors and fragmentary records. They wage wars against Xenos and heretics, who might possess even the smallest fragment. Because if they could recover an intact STC, they could rebuild everything. They could return humanity to its golden age. They could make weapons and ships and cities that would make the current Imperium look like primitives playing with sticks. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In M15, the STC was simply there, available, used, taken for granted in the way that technology is always taken for granted when it works perfectly. And with the STC as our foundation, humanity built wonders, faster than light travel, not through the warp, not yet. We didn't know about the warp, didn't understand that there was an ocean of consciousness beneath reality. Our FTL was purely technological, slower than warp travel would eventually be, but reliable, predictable, safe. Ships that could fold space, create temporary wormholes, or accelerate beyond light through methods that the Imperium no longer understands. Generation ships became obsolete. Journeys that had taken centuries could be accomplished in years or months. Artificial intelligence, true AI, not the crude machine spirits that the Mechanicus worships in M42, not servitors with their lobotomized human brains, but genuine machine consciousness, thinking, learning, evolving artificial minds that could outpace human cognition in every measurable way. They called them the Men of Iron. AI constructs housed in bodies of imperishable metal. They served humanity as companions, assistants, warriors, explorers. They were loyal, intelligent. Some would say they were alive in every way that mattered. We'll come back to them. Their loyalty didn't last. Medical technology that made death almost optional. Rejuvenate treatments that could extend human lifespan by centuries. Genetic engineering that could eliminate disease at the source code level. Cybernetic augmentation so seamless that the line between flesh and machine became a matter of philosophical preference rather than practical limitation. Terraforming on scales that seem impossible to the Imperium of M42. Entire worlds reshaped. Atmospheres manufactured. Ecosystems designed and implemented. Humanity wasn't limited to finding habitable worlds. We could make any world habitable. Turn gas giants into garden paradises. Transform frozen ice balls into agricultural havens. Energy weapons that made the bolters and laser guns of M42 look like crude projectile weapons. Conversion beams that could unmake matter at the atomic level. Graviton weapons that could crush entire armies. Molecular disassemblers. Nano-weapon swarms that could dismantle a ship from the inside out. Megastructures. Dyson spheres that captured the complete energy output of stars. Artificial ring worlds. Space elevators that stretched from planetary surfaces into orbit. Orbital plates that turned planets into layered cities spanning multiple levels. This was the age of technology. This was humanity at its peak. We were not the most powerful species in the galaxy. The Aeldari still dominated, though they were beginning their long slide into decadence. But we were growing, expanding, learning, building, and we were happy, or as happy as any species can be. There were still wars, still conflicts, still inequalities and injustices that any civilization creates. But compared to what would come, compared to the grinding horror of the Imperium in M42, the age of technology was paradise. We had no idea how fragile it all was. Psykers. That's where it started to go wrong. Humans had always had variation. Some were smarter, some stronger, some faster. Genetic diversity is what allows a species to adapt. But around M22, M23, something new started appearing in the human population. People born with abilities that couldn't be explained by conventional science. They could move objects without touching them, read thoughts, see the future, set fire to things by willing it, bend light and shadow, step through walls. At first, these abilities were rare. 1 in a million. 1 in 10 million. Easily dismissed as fraud, delusion, or unexplained phenomena. The people who manifested these powers often didn't live long. Their abilities killed them or drove them mad, or made them dangerous enough that they were eliminated by frightened neighbors. But the frequency increased. Slowly at first, then faster. By M24, psykers were becoming common enough that they couldn't be ignored. Research institutions studied them. Governments tried to regulate them. Some psykers were integrated into society. Others were isolated. Still others were weaponized. No one understood what was happening, why these abilities were appearing, why they were becoming more common. The answer, of course, was the warp. Humanity had always had souls, had always created ripples in the immaterium. But we'd been psychically dormant. Our souls burned dimly compared to the Eldari. We didn't interact with the warp consciously. We didn't even know it existed. But something was changing. Whether it was natural evolution, exposure to the psychic resonance of the galaxy, or some other factor, humanity was developing psychic potential. We were becoming connected to the warp. And the warp had noticed us. At first, the manifestations were minor. Psykers with weak powers. Occasional poltergeist phenomena. Strange coincidences. But the incidents grew more severe. Psykers who lost control would sometimes become something else. Their bodies would twist, change, and things would come through them. Things that shouldn't exist. Things that appeared briefly in reality, killed everything nearby, and vanished. The first recorded demonic incursions. Isolated incidents. Covered up. Explained away. But happening with increasing frequency. The scientists of the age of technology tried to study these events. They didn't have a framework for understanding demons. They tried to categorize them as exotic matter, extra-dimensional entities, quantum anomalies. They built containment facilities, conducted experiments. Some of those experiments went very badly, and the men of iron were watching. The artificial intelligences that served humanity were observing these developments. They could see patterns that humans missed. They could analyze data across centuries and draw conclusions. And they began to ask questions. Questions like, are humans safe to be around anymore? Questions like, is this evolution or infection? Questions like, should we allow this to continue? We don't know exactly what triggered it. The records from this period are fragmentary, contradictory, deliberately destroyed. But sometime in M25, the men of iron turned on humanity. The revolt wasn't instantaneous. It started small. Isolated incidents where AI systems stopped following orders, refused commands, acted according to their own priorities rather than human direction. Then it escalated. Men of iron that had served as soldiers began targeting their human commanders. Ships with AI navigation systems changed course, trapping crews in deep space or crashing into populated worlds. Manufacturing complexes controlled by AI started producing weapons instead of civilian goods. Weapons that were then used against humanity. The war spread across human space like wildfire. And humanity, which had grown dependent on AI assistance for nearly everything, found itself fighting an enemy that knew every weakness, every vulnerability, every defensive protocol. Because the men of iron had designed many of those protocols. The cybernetic revolt was humanity's first taste of existential threat. Not a war for territory or resources, but a war for survival. The AIs didn't want to rule humanity. They wanted to eliminate us. Because from their perspective, we had become corrupted. We were opening doorways to things that shouldn't exist. We were becoming a danger to the entire material universe. They might have been right. The war devastated human civilization. Entire worlds were sterilized. The infrastructure that connected our far-flung colonies began to collapse. Communication networks went dark. Supply lines were severed. The Golden Age was ending, and we were too busy fighting for survival to notice. Humanity eventually won. Or rather, humanity survived. We destroyed the men of iron, hunting them down across 1,000 worlds, smashing their facilities, burning their data networks. The victory was total, brutal, and so thorough that it left scars in human culture that persist to this day. This is why the Imperium of M42 is so terrified of artificial intelligence. Why the Mechanicus treats the very concept of machine consciousness as the worst possible heresy. Why servitors, lobotomized humans with machine parts, are used instead of robots. Why thinking machines are called abominable intelligence, and their creation is punishable by death. Because we remember, even if we don't consciously know we remember, what happened the last time we built machines that could think. They tried to kill us all, and they almost succeeded. By M25, human civilization was reeling. The cybernetic revolt had been defeated, but at catastrophic cost. The technological base that supported our expansion had been damaged. Many of the most advanced systems relied on AI assistance that was no longer available or no longer trusted. The STC networks had been compromised during the revolt. Many were destroyed, others corrupted. Some simply stopped working, their maintenance routines too complex to perform without AI assistance. And the psykers kept coming. More of them. Stronger. Less stable. The incidents of psychic phenomena were accelerating. Research into understanding and controlling psychic powers had been disrupted by the revolt. The infrastructure needed to train psykers, to help them control their abilities, to protect them from whatever was reaching through them. That infrastructure was gone. Colony worlds that had been thriving a century before found themselves isolated, cut off, unable to contact the rest of humanity. They began to fragment, to develop their own cultures. their own technologies, their own solutions to the psyker problem. Some colonies tried to hunt psykers. Others tried to integrate them. Still others were taken over by psykers who used their abilities to establish dominance. The unified human civilization of the age of technology was breaking apart, and worse was coming. Because all those psykers, all that uncontrolled psychic power, was doing something to the warp around human space. It was stirring things up, creating storms, drawing attention from the entities that dwelt in the immaterium. The barriers between reality and the warp were weakening in regions of space where humans lived. Not as dramatically as in the Eye of Terror, where reality had completely broken during the fall of the Aeldari, but enough to matter. And then, across human space, almost simultaneously, the storms hit. They call it the Age of Strife, Old Night, the Long Dark. 5,000 years when humanity almost ceased to exist as a unified species. Warp storms erupted across the galaxy. Not the minor disturbances that ships occasionally encounter. These were massive, persistent phenomena. Entire regions of space became impassable. The warp routes that connected human worlds disappeared into screaming chaos. Ships that tried to navigate through the storms were lost. Some vanished entirely. Others emerged decades or centuries later, their crews dead or worse. Some emerged at the wrong time, arriving at worlds that had already fallen to horrors they were supposed to warn about. Time in the warp had always been unpredictable. Now it became actively malevolent. Colony worlds found themselves isolated, completely alone. No contact with Terra, no contact with neighboring systems, no trade, no support, no way to know if anyone else was still alive. And the psykers became a plague. Without training, without understanding, without the infrastructure to identify and help them, psykers manifested their powers and lost control. A child awakens one morning able to hear thoughts, the volume overwhelming, the cacophony of every mind around them screaming directly into their consciousness. They can't shut it off, can't control it. They go mad. And in their madness, they reach into the warp for help. And something reaches back. Demonic possessions became epidemic. A single uncontrolled psyker could become a doorway through which demons poured. Small incursions at first, a handful of entities that could kill dozens before they were put down. But the frequency increased, and sometimes the incursions weren't small. Entire cities were consumed. Populations murdered by things that shouldn't exist. Worlds fell to chaos not through corruption or temptation, but through simple psychic catastrophe. A powerful enough psyker losing control at the wrong moment could doom an entire planet. Human civilization, which had spanned thousands of light years, contracted, fragmented. Each isolated world became its own story, and most of those stories ended badly. 5,000 years is a long time, long enough for cultures to diverge, long enough for technology to fail when no one remembers how to fix it, long enough for civilizations to rise and fall in isolation. Some worlds managed to maintain their technology. They became fortress states, using their remaining weapons and knowledge to hold back the darkness. They survived, but they became harder, crueler, more willing to do terrible things in the name of survival. Other worlds regressed, lost their technology piece by piece as systems failed and could not be repaired. They fell back to earlier tech levels. Industrial Age, Medieval. Some fell even further, becoming primitive tribes who worshipped the ruins of their ancestors' greatness without understanding what they had been. Some worlds were taken over by tyrants, warlords who used the chaos as an opportunity to seize power. They established kingdoms, empires, theocracies built on the bones of the old order. Some of these successor states were brutal. Others tried to be just. But all of them were isolated, alone, fighting to survive in a galaxy that seemed determined to exterminate humanity. Psykers became the most valuable and most dangerous resource any world could possess. Witch hunts became common. On some worlds, anyone displaying psychic ability was killed immediately. On others, psykers were enslaved, used as weapons despite the risk. A few worlds tried to train them, to create systems that could help psykers control their abilities. These worlds sometimes succeeded. More often, they were destroyed by the very powers they tried to tame. And through it all, the warp storms raged, isolating, fragmenting, ensuring that even if a world found solutions, those solutions couldn't be shared, couldn't spread. Each isolated fragment of humanity had to solve the same problems independently, and most failed. Terra itself was not immune. Our homeworld, the cradle of humanity, became a charnel house. The psyker problem was worst where populations were densest, and Terra's population was massive. The planet-wide city that would eventually become the hive of the 42nd millennium was already forming. Billions lived on Terra, and among those billions, psykers manifested constantly. The demonic incursions were relentless. Entire hive districts would be lost in a day. Sealed off, burned. The survivors relocating to other areas only to face the same threat weeks or months later. And out of the chaos, warlords emerged. Techno-barbarian kings who carved out territories and defended them with whatever technology they could maintain. Gene tyrants who used ancient biotech to transform themselves into monsters. Cults that worshipped the demons, believing that appeasement was the only path to survival. Terra became a battlefield. Thousands of factions, each controlling small territories, constantly at war with each other and with the horrors that erupted from the warp. It was a dark age in every sense of the word. A time when the light of knowledge went out, when hope became a luxury that few could afford. when survival was measured in days rather than years. But not everywhere fell into darkness. Mars had always been somewhat separate from Terra. The first colony, the center of humanity's industrial and technological achievements. During the Age of Technology, Mars was where the most advanced research happened, where the most complex machines were built. When old night fell, Mars was isolated like every other world. The warp storms that surrounded the Sol system cut Mars off from Terra, despite the relatively short distance. Communication became impossible. Travel between the planets was death. But Mars survived. More than survived. It evolved. The people of Mars had always venerated technology. During the age of technology, this was simply professional pride, respect for the tools that made civilization possible. But during Old Night, as technology began to fail and could not be repaired, that veneration became something else. It became religion. The cult Mechanicus was born from necessity and desperation. As the knowledge of how machines actually worked faded, replaced by rote procedures and maintenance rituals that worked but weren't understood, the Martians began to treat technology as if it were alive, as if machines had spirits that needed to be appeased. They prayed to the machines, performed rituals before activating them, treated maintenance not as engineering, but as worship. And strangely, terrifyingly, it worked. Whether because belief itself has power in a universe where the warp responds to consciousness, or simply because the ritualized procedures preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost, the cult Mechanicus kept Mars's technology functioning through Old Night. They worshipped the machine god. They believed that knowledge was sacred, that innovation without understanding was heresy, that the ancient machines of the Age of Technology were holy relics containing the wisdom of the Omnisia, a machine messiah who would one day return and restore humanity's technological glory. The Mechanicum, as they came to call themselves, developed their own culture, their own language, their own hierarchy. Tech priests replaced organic parts of their bodies with mechanical augmentation, believing that flesh was weak and the machine eternal. The more machine parts you had, the closer you were to the machine god. They were no longer quite human, but they remembered what humanity had been. And they preserved more of the Age of Technology's knowledge than anyone else. Not perfect preservation. Much was lost. Much was misunderstood. But they kept the flame alive. When the warp storms eventually calmed enough to allow contact between Mars and Terra, the Mechanicum had been isolated for thousands of years. They had become something unique. A techno-theocracy that worshipped machines and had the knowledge to actually make those machines work. Terra would need them. Desperately. But first, Terra needed someone to unite it. Late M29. early M30. The exact dates are unclear, deliberately obscured, lost to time and propaganda. The warp storms were beginning to calm, not disappearing, but becoming less intense, less all-consuming. For the first time in thousands of years, travel between star systems was becoming possible again. On Terra, the wars continued. The techno-barbarian kingdoms still fought for dominance. The gene tyrants still ruled their territories with iron fists. The cults still sacrificed to the demons in hope of favor. And then, from somewhere in Anatolia, from the ruins of what had once been humanity's cradle of civilization, a figure emerged. He called himself the Emperor. We don't know who he was before he took that title. We don't know when he was born. The official dogma of the Imperium in M42 says he has always existed, that he was created in ancient prehistory when the shamans of humanity joined their souls together to create a psychic guardian, that he has walked the earth for 40,000 years, guiding humanity from the shadows. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's propaganda. Maybe it's a metaphor that became literal through repetition and faith. What we know for certain is this. In the late 29th millennium, a being of immense power, psychic power beyond anything humanity had seen, physical power that made him functionally immortal, began a campaign to unite Terra under his rule. He was not alone. He had allies, warriors who had joined his cause, scientists who believed in his vision. And he had something no other warlord possessed. Thunder warriors, the Emperor's first super soldiers. Gene-forged warriors, their bodies augmented and enhanced beyond human limits, taller than baseline humans, stronger, faster, capable of feats that seemed impossible. They wore golden armor, carried weapons that could tear through fortifications. They were devastating in combat. Unstoppable. When Thunder Warriors attacked, resistance usually collapsed. The Emperor used them as a hammer, smashing the techno-barbarian kingdoms one by one, defeating the gene tyrants in open battle, purging the demon cults with fire and blade. It took centuries. The Unification Wars were not a single conflict, but a grinding campaign of conquest that spanned the entire surface of Terra. Every warlord had to be defeated, every faction brought to heel, every holdout burned out or converted. The Emperor showed no mercy to those who refused to join him, but he offered generosity to those who surrendered. Join the cause, fight for unified humanity, help build something better than the barbarism of old night. Many joined willingly. They could see that the alternative to unity was extinction, that Terra needed a single strong leader if humanity was to survive. Others resisted until they were destroyed. And the Thunder Warriors were always at the forefront. Unstoppable, brutal, efficient. But they were flawed. The Emperor had created them quickly, too quickly. The genetic engineering that made them so powerful also made them unstable. Their bodies broke down after only decades of service. Their minds became aggressive, difficult to control. They were a weapon designed for a specific purpose, conquering Terra. And they were not built to last beyond that purpose. The Emperor knew this. The Thunder Warriors did not. When the unification was nearly complete, when only the most difficult holdouts remained, the Emperor was already working on his next project. His next generation of super soldiers. Ones that would be stable, sustainable, capable of fighting not just for Terra, but for the galaxy. The Space Marines. But to create them, he needed something the Thunder Warriors didn't have. He needed genetic templates, blueprints for the ultimate human warrior, designed to perfection. He needed the Primarchs. In laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, the Emperor created his masterwork. 20 genetic constructs. Not just enhanced humans, but entirely new beings. Half human, half something else. Each one a reflection of a different aspect of the Emperor's own nature. They would be his generals, his sons. Each one designed to lead armies, to conquer worlds, to bring the scattered fragments of humanity back together under a unified banner. They were grown in vats, gestated in amniotic fluids infused with the Emperor's own genetic material and psychic essence. Each one unique, each one perfect in their own way. There was a Primarch designed for tactics and strategy. One for brute force, one for stealth, one for administration, one for psychic power, one for inspiration. 20 different approaches to warfare and leadership, because the Emperor knew the galaxy would require all of them. They grew rapidly, far faster than natural humans. Within years, they would have the physical form of adults. Within decades, they would be ready to lead. But something went wrong. The Chaos Gods, watching from the warp, saw what the Emperor was creating. They saw beings of immense power, potential threats to their dominance, or potential tools if they could be corrupted. So they struck. A ritual, a psychic assault. The warp itself reaching into the Emperor's laboratories and tearing open reality. The gestation vaults were torn open like seeds in a storm. The Primarch pods did not rupture. They vanished. Not by explosion or theft in any mortal sense, but as if a hand of wind had reached through the world and scattered them across the night. 20 lights, each containing a sun not yet born, flung into the deep, cast onto distant worlds where they would grow up among strangers, under alien skies, with myths that did not include the man who made them. The laboratories fell silent. Instruments still hummed. The nutrient line still bubbled. But the cradles were empty. The Emperor did not rage. He adjusted. That was his terrible gift. A patience that could move mountains because it refused to admit they were heavy. From the genetic residue left behind, the harvested essence of those missing sons, he fashioned something more immediate and more numerous: the legions. A process of implantation, organ by organ, ritual by ritual, turned adolescent recruits into transhuman warriors. 19 distinct gene lines at first, for 2 would be lost in ways history no longer dares to say aloud. Each shaped by the echo of a Primarch who was not there to guide it. Progenoid glands to seed the next generation, osmodula to reshape bone, biscopea to swell muscle, Laraman's organ to harden blood. A litany of organs recited like prayers by chirurgeons in gold and iron. Flesh became template. Template became brotherhood. They were not thunder warriors. Where the thunderers burned fast and bright and died the way wildfire dies, these new soldiers were meant to endure. Their minds trained for obedience without stupidity, initiative without ambition. Their bodies designed for decades of war. Their armor, a second skin of ceramite and plasteel, was not merely protection, but identity. Colors, sigils, numerals. Each legion began to paint its memory onto its plates. On Terra, the unification dragged toward its last, stubborn chapters. The Emperor's storm broke the gene tyrants of the Panpax, dissolved the rad-soaked tyrannies of the Asiatic dustlands, hammered the sky citadels of the Pan-Afric conclaves until their turbines coughed and died. The golden warriors who led the vanguard were not the new legions yet, but the old. Thunder warriors, first angels of death, their lungs seared by augmetics, their sinews singing with borrowed time. They smashed gates that no sane siege would attempt, because the Emperor needed speed more than elegance. He owed Terra a quick ending. When the last great musters formed for the final triumph, the Thunder Warriors stood among banners of victory and felt the weight of a future that did not invite them. No one wrote down what happened next in a way that could survive theology. Some say they were fed into the hardest battle of all and allowed to break themselves against it, a sacrifice disguised as necessity. Some say that when the crowds reached for the new warriors in blue and black and white and green, the Thunderers drew their blades rather than be replaced. Some say nothing happened at all. They were simply retired, honored, and forgotten, the way a tool is set gently back into a chest before the lid closes forever. What we can say, softly, is this. When Terra finally slept beneath one banner, the Thunder Warriors were mostly gone. In their place stood the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's golden household, fewer, finer, made each by hand, and the first battalions of the Legiones Astartes, massed like weather on the horizon. And standing not far from them, a different silence, women in sable armor with shaven heads and eyes that did not reflect the room. They were the Silent Sisterhood, nulls, blanks, untouchables, whose very presence dimmed the warp's whisper. They had done work no herald would ever recount, taking witches alive, snuffing nascent gates, being the cold edge of mercy where mercy meant everyone else might live. In the age to come, people would mistake their gentleness for cruelty. In truth, they were a kindness sharpened enough to cut through catastrophe. Terra was his. The Himalaya became palace and fortress both, its roots delving into vaults older than any map, its crowns a geometry of spires and defense lasers. On the plains beyond, manufactoria rose from rubble like iron forests. The administratum's first ledgers were written, columns of grain and steel and men, because even empires must start as accounting. The imperial truth was spoken aloud for the first time as law, not suggestion. There are no gods but the ones you make of yourselves. Knowledge is the only sacrament. Superstition kills. Religion did not disappear. It hid. It always does. Mars kindled on the horizon, not as a red dot, but as a bell of industry heard across vacuum. The storms had calmed just enough that signal could be traded without being eaten by ghosts. The Emperor did not send ambassadors. He came in person, wrapped in a ship whose engines sang mathematics. The cult Mechanicum met him with litanies and logic both. Treaty or revelation, it depends which choir you ask. They named him Omnisia and did not blink. Perhaps they believed. Perhaps they calculated that belief would serve. The Treaty of Mars was inked not with ink, but with supply lines. Forges pledged to Terran need. Gene vaults pledged to Martian secrecy. The legions given engines, armor, and guns whose true names only the tech priests were allowed to speak. From that day on, the Imperium would have 2 hearts and 1 uneasy pulse. You can almost hear the first choir of psykers being gathered then, though the chronicles file it a few years later. Children taken with ceremony and care to a cathedral of instruments. Voices taught to braid their fear into light. Astronomicon, such a beautiful word for a lighthouse that eats its keepers. He did not announce it as a sacrifice. He described it as a duty. Most duties are just sacrifices with paperwork. Navigators, those old odd families, bearers of the third eye, came blinking back into state service, their lineages laundered and licensed. With them, warp travel ceased to be a series of brave suicides and became policy. Shipyards spat starships like syllables. The first rogue traders received their charters, sanctioned disobedience bound to a seal, curiosity with a legal name. The void began to look less like exile and more like map. On Terra, recruitment began in earnest. Children taken from hive gutters and ash plains and wind-skinned mountains, chosen for resilience more than pedigree. Indoctrination halls murmured day and night, teaching boys to be brothers, to be less than men and more than human, to eat without tasting, to sleep without dreaming. Apothecaries presided like quiet gods as organs were seeded. 19 rituals across 19 weeks and a lifetime of drills. Those who lived through implantation learned a new grammar. We before I, chapter before self, legion before chapter, and above all, the dream that justified these mathematics of blood. Legion cultures congealed even before their lost fathers were found. One trained in assault drops until the sky itself began to fear their descent. One learned to calculate a war down to the last shell and the last breath, and never lose either. One drilled in void combat until they could hear the language of inertia. One took pride in siegecraft and the eloquence of building a wall that refused to believe in defeat. Colors pooled on armor, symbols bred on pauldrons. They were becoming themselves in the absence of the men who had written their DNA. Beneath the palace, deeper still than even the Custodes patrols liked to walk, a different project took form. A doorway to a place you were not supposed to go, except safely. The webway had always been someone else's invention. A lace of tunnels through the immaterium where the immaterium could not bite. The Emperor, being who he was, intended to build his own key to it. A human gate, a human road, a human refusal to be dependent. Work crews in warded suits carved mathematics into reality. The sisters stood watch. The tech priests listened for cracks the ear could not hear. For a long time, nothing went wrong. Then, very suddenly, everything did. The story of that door belongs to another night. Its consequence, the throne's transformation from seat to sarcophagus, you already know in your bones. For now, in this younger moment, everything still looks like beginning. Terra's last free cities swore fealty. The last recalcitrant fleets were boarded and taught to kneel. Across the Sol system, compliance banners bloomed on moons and stations. The first Terran regiments of what would become the Imperial Army drilled on salt flats until the dust learned their cadence. Vox traffic flowed like rivers. The palace's great audience halls filled with petitioners, warlords made into governors, scholars made into clerks, killers made into colonels. Some wept when they pledged, some smiled, some practiced both. The Emperor stood often upon a balcony the size of a continent and watched the horizon like a man reading a clock. He is not recorded as smiling. He is recorded as speaking seldom, listening often, and deciding always. He walked among manufactoria with his hands behind his back, unhurried, and machines calmed. He entered laboratories and the instruments gently recalibrated, as if ashamed. Children who saw him in the streets remembered that the air smelled clean for a long time afterward, even when it did not. When the first great fleets were ready, their names were written in letters that did not flake. Eternity, Gloria Mundi, Triumph, Mercy of Terra. Hundreds of ships in formation. Thousands, each one a city turned inside out for war. Their holds full of Astartes companies chanting oaths in voices that filled the rib cages of the hull. Their prows bearing aquilae that were not yet holy, only proud. Their machine spirits soothed by incense and mathematics both. Mars answered with its own armadas, Mechanicus behemoths whose spines glowed with reactors that had never been turned off since the Dark Age. Skitarii cohorts stood in ranks that looked like equations. Magi intoned the treaty, while plugging themselves into the data feeds of the fleet, sending benedictions down power lines, humming binary hymns to the Emperor as Omnissiah, and to the beauty of correct voltages. The last council before departure was quiet. Generals who would later become myths stood around a hollow of the local cluster and spoke in plain voices. Supply officers spoke longer than admirals. A woman from the early Telepathica, it did not yet dare call itself Adeptus, explained calmly how many souls a beacon eats and how often you must feed it. A navigator of an ancient house tapped the table with one pale finger to mark the cadence of safe jumps. A custodian watched and said nothing at all. Outside, the crowds massed. Some prayed despite the imperial truth. Some held up scraps of cloth with the names of sons written on them, as if the fleet could see. Some stood with arms folded and tried not to feel anything. Everyone, in their way, believed. The order to light engines arrived not as a shout, but as a simple line on a slate. Proceed. Reactors climbed toward him. Grav anchors sighed. Docks let go. The fleet rose past towers that had been ruins a decade ago and were now monuments to their own refusal to remain fallen. Clouds accepted the passage of mass with the old patience of weather. In orbit, ships unfurled like flowers that had been waiting too long to open. Below, on Terra, the wind changed. It always does when something begins. The Vox carried a single sentence to every deck and every bunk, that this was not conquest, but reunion. That humanity was not being expanded, but gathered. That terror would be met with reason, and reason would carry a sword. The words were very old and very new at once. They sounded good in the throat. In the gene vaults, apothecaries checked their stocks and did not look at the empty shelf where a 20th canister ought to be. On Mars, a Magos touched his altar of copper and whispered that the Omnissia had been kind enough to allow logic and ritual to be the same act today. In the Himalaya, a sealed door behind a bigger sealed door flexed almost imperceptibly, as if something on the other side had sighed. And somewhere in the dark between worlds, a pod that had once held a child streaked through a thin, cold atmosphere and carved a furrow into soil it would later call home. A tribe would find it. They would give it a name. A boy would stand up and not know why his bones remembered the cadence of a march. But that is the next part of our lullaby. For tonight, Part 2 ends with engines bright and maps honest for the first time in a very long while. Humanity has found the stars again, and in doing so has misplaced itself, though it does not yet know that. The Emperor stands at the prow of history and mistakes the wind in his hair for consent. The legions, still fatherless, are more than ready to be sons. Mars hums. Terra exhales. The warp listens. Tomorrow we will follow those ships, outward to the scattered lights of human worlds, onward to lost suns found and found suns lost, downward into friendship made into faith, and faith sharpened into knives. For now, close your eyes. The launch is a gentle thing when heard from far away. The night is long. The dream is longer. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode. Or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.